thanks very much. Hello, everyone. It's really nice to be here, as always. Always very nice to be in Greece. I was actually yesterday at another Economist event on sustainable finance, not sustainable tourism, in Woligmeni. So it's great to be able to join your event today. So what I'm going to say is going to be a little bit at odds, maybe, with the mood music of the present moment, especially in this industry, which is having quite a good year, and especially in Greece, I think. And that was even notable at our event yesterday, where the discussion about the economic outlook is much more positive in Greece than it is, I can certainly tell you, in the UK, but also elsewhere in the Eurozone. But it's important to anticipate what's coming and to think about how to meet the challenges ahead, which I think is the idea of this forum, Refocus, See a New Future. So we at the EIU, we're in the business of forecasting, and our job is to tell our clients what to expect next and what it means for their business operations. So looking at what is coming next, this is not working. Do I need to point it somewhere else? It's just slow. Looking at what is coming next for the global and the European economy, we have to start, of course, with the war in Ukraine, which has ushered in a new era of uncertainty and anxiety. We never thought that this war would be over quickly, and we expect it to continue through this year and through 2023, and probably much longer. Why is that? Number one, Ukraine believes that it's winning, and it seems to be winning at the moment, and morale is very high. And the Western Alliance will continue to support and arm Ukraine for the foreseeable future. And I don't really see an erosion of support for Ukraine happening anytime soon, though of course we have to see what happens this winter. Another reason why this will continue is because Russia cannot afford to lose this war either. Vladimir Putin is now actually fighting for his political life. It's become an existential issue for the regime in Moscow. So in the face of setbacks, of which there have been many, setbacks and miscalculations, the response from Russia is to double down, as we've seen with recent developments with the referendums and plans to annex territory, occupied territory in eastern Ukraine, and this partial mobilization that is taking place. And finally, this war is not something that is really susceptible to a neat and tidy resolution. And in many ways, it's a classic frontier war, which began really in 2014, and could turn out to be just an endless frontier war. And the reason why that is because Russia will seek to retain occupied territory. That is obviously unacceptable to Ukraine, which is not prepared to accept this infringement of its sovereignty. And so even if there is at some point a negotiated end to the war, it's unlikely to be a durable solution, and any line of demarcation is likely to be contested for a long time to come. So the upshot is that this is a long war. Sanctions are definitely here to stay. Russia is cut off from the Western security, political, and economic order. And we have to look at a permanent reorganization of supply chains. And that's going to take quite a long time. So just to look at what is the fallout for the economy, the global economy, this year and next year and beyond. I think it's clear to everybody that the war, there's been three main channels of impact of the war on the global economy, and that is sanctions, supply chains, and commodities prices. So on sanctions, obviously we have those that target the Russian economy directly, such as the ones imposed on the Russian central bank. And then there are those that impact indirectly by making it very difficult to trade with Russia. And those latter are obviously the ones that are having the biggest impact on those economies which trade very closely with Russia, which are mostly in Europe. The second channel of impact is through disrupted supply chains. Now, there were already very big issues with supply chains because of the pandemic disruption, and that's been compounded by war-related sanctions, airspace bans, blocked ports, sea routes, and security concerns in general. And obviously, China's zero COVID policy continues to have a negative impact on supply chains too, affecting business quite seriously in Europe, and we see that visibly at the moment. The third and the main impact of the war on the global economy stems from this very sharp rise in commodities prices that we've seen. They've risen for three reasons. One is because of concern about supplies. Secondly, because of destruction of physical infrastructure and sanctions over compliance. And that is the fact that some commodities traders are choosing not to do business with Russia, even though it's not, that doesn't come under the sanctions, but they're refusing to do business for fear of falling foul of sanctions. So it's an over-compliance that is taking place. So the upshot of that is that we expect oil prices to remain elevated as long as this hot war in Ukraine continues. So we expect dated Brent blend to trade around $90 to $100 per barrel over the rest of the year, around $90 US dollars per barrel in 2023. And, you know, we expect pretty much the same for natural gas prices in Europe, especially following the complete cutoff of gas to Europe via Nord Stream 2. So obviously natural gas prices will fall, but they're going to remain at high levels relative to the pre-war situation. So the upshot of all this is that, as we know, inflation is rampant. We estimate that it's going to average around 9.5%, that's globally, this year. That's the highest level for 26 years. And the response of or as we know, of the Fed and ECB and all the major central banks is that they are raising interest rates very aggressively to try to contain inflation, which is not working so well because this is supply side driven inflation. We expect price rises to slow, the rate of increase to slow, but nevertheless, price levels are going to remain very high this year and next year. So again, much higher relative to the pre-war situation. And then the upshot of all this is that growth is going to take a big hit, actually a much bigger hit next year than this year, because this year we had very strong growth, post-pandemic growth, continuing into Q1 and even Q2 in many places in Europe. So this is just a chart that's showing the impact this year. What we estimate is that the war is going to shave about 1 percentage point from global growth this year. We forecast growth of 2.6%, compared with our forecast before the invasion of 3.9% for the global economy. So that's about $1 trillion US dollars. So it's not a small amount that we're talking about. That's GDP lost as a result of the war and the fallout from it. And so this chart is just showing you the difference between our pre-war and our post-war forecasts. And what it shows, almost without exception, is that the war is inflicting quite a lot of damage economically. Obviously, that's to say nothing about the incalculable loss of human life as a result of the war. And the biggest downgrades, apart from Russia, of course, are for the leading European economies. So we see a 1.3 percentage point hit to growth in the Eurozone, excuse me, in 2022. So we're forecasting growth of 2.7% on average in the Eurozone this year, compared with 4% before the war. Just to say one word about the southern European economies, such as Greece, which are a partial exception to this trend, and that's because of this pent-up demand for tourism services that we've seen this year, which means that in Greece we're going to see real GDP growth of 5 to 6% this year, which is, a good outturn, but we need to remember that this is from a lower starting point because of lost output in 2020, when we had negative growth of around 9%. We had a rebound of 8% in 2021. So, that I think it's important to remember that, and also to remember that growth would have been much stronger without the impact of the war and inflation and everything else. Just a couple more points about the US and China. So what's happening in the US is that this aggressive monetary tightening by the Fed has led us to lower our growth outlook, and we're now expecting growth of 1.5% in the US in 2022. China obviously is experiencing a real slowdown, significant slowdown. We're forecasting 3.3% growth this year, and that's because of the zero COVID policies, a power crisis, droughts, slowing global demand, and property sector woes that we have all followed. So there were a few exceptions. So there was a few commodities producers, obviously, which are benefiting in Middle East and Latin America. And then, so do you want to go back to the, no. And Indonesia was growing quite strongly. Turkey was growing quite strongly. So, but again, that doesn't mean to say that the Turkish economy is not in quite a bit of trouble. But I think we're forecasting growth of around 4% in Turkey this year. And obviously there's a lot of pump priming going on by the government, and there's an election coming up next year. But if with inflation running around 100%, there's people are not very happy in Turkey at the moment. Lira's under a lot of pressure. So it doesn't look too bad in terms of the headline number, but that disguises a lot of problems. Turkey's, I don't know how familiar you are with Turkey. Turkey's an interesting economy. It's a big economy. People are quite resilient in the face of, a lot of problems. So, and people work very hard. And so, there's a kind of underlying, dynamism, but it's, I wouldn't say that the Turkish economy is in great shape, and they've got a lot of problems at the moment. Obviously, in terms of the policies, a lot of pressure on the currency, pressure in terms of debt, and so on. So this is looking at 20. I'm looking at so much to get through. I hope I'm going to get through everything. Looking at 2023. So things are going to get a lot worse in 2023. So, this map is showing that the impact next year is going to be much greater. And that's because the EU, the US, and the Chinese economies are going to be growing slower. Well, China's picking up, that's for sure, from this year. So we're forecasting growth of about 5.5% next year. So the best performing economies that you're seeing here are shown in red, and purple are the worst performing, green to blue to purple, performing worse. So the reds and the oranges are to be found in the East, in Asia, Middle East, parts of sub-Saharan Africa, a few commodities exporters. So we're seeing this rebound in Chinese growth. Actually, I think it's about 5% we're forecasting next year, and that's going to have positive ripple effects through the Asian region. The main worry here is not the war, but the zero COVID policies, which I can talk about a bit later, because we expect those to continue through 2023, although there will be then some easing, but that will only begin to show through in the second half of the year. So if anybody thinks that China is going to come to the rescue, or Chinese tourists of tourism next year, it might not happen that early. It might be 2024, but we can talk about that mainly. So the point here is that the outlook is much more gloomy for the major centers of global growth, and that's US and EU. So we're forecasting US growth of 0.5% next year, and in the Eurozone we're forecasting a mild, excuse me, a mild recession. I talked too much yesterday. Mild recession of 0.4%. I just want to say a little bit more about Europe, given that's the focus for most people, I imagine, in this room. We're talking about a recession in the Eurozone, but not on the scale or anything like the scale of the pandemic recession. But we do expect that Germany and France and Italy and Spain and Netherlands and Austria and Belgium and the UK are going to register shallow recessions, ranging so between 0% down to minus 1.3, something like that, 1.3%. And the assumptions behind that is that we expect that Russian gas flows to Europe are going to just remain around zero, at or around 0%. That's through Nord Stream 2, Nord Stream 1, for the foreseeable future. And EU efforts to replace Russian gas with other pipelines and liquefied natural gas, they're yielding some results, but they can't go much further in the short term given the infrastructure constraints. So on the demand side, what we're going to see is that demand for gas will be suppressed by the EU's plan to cut demand by 15%, and it will also be suppressed by the impact on consumers of higher gas prices. We expect some countries to be unable to meet their gas needs this winter without severe reductions in demand. And we're seeing the impact on major industrial producers already, who are doing that already. So the depth of this energy and growth crunch really depends on a few uncertainties. So, number one, how cold this winter is. Number two, how far EU solidarity holds up, both around demand reduction and gas sharing. How effectively firms are able to move away from gas usage and instead use oil, electricity, and so on, and that's going to vary by country. Austria and Germany, which are highly dependent on Russian gas, have limited alternative supply options, will face shortages and plan to ration gas use. Italy, which relies heavily on gas, will also be severely affected. Greece is better placed. It won't have shortages, but it will suffer from the impact of higher prices and recession in major economies in Europe. Landlocked Central European countries will experience a triple shock of supply, prices, and the recession fallout. And next winter is not going to be that much easier, because what's going to happen this winter is that Europe is going to completely deplete its storage, which doesn't usually happen, and start from zero next year. So next year, growth is going to be held back by prices remaining high inflation, which is going to weigh on consumers' purchasing power, global supply chain disruptions, including shortages of semiconductors, which continues, a subdued external environment with growth in the US slowing considerably. And on top of all that, we have tightening monetary policy with interest rates rising sharply across Europe. I won't go into detail about that, but we expect interest rates to rise to around 2.83% ECB rates, short-term rates, next year. And even in the face of recession, we expect the ECB to persist with that policy. So this is going to result in households and businesses facing big cost pressures, having to make difficult decisions about spending, about borrowing, about investing. And so just to finish, I want to just talk about the impact on tourism industry. Next slide, please. Yeah. This is it. So yeah, on tourism. So tourism's having a pretty good year, which is what we expected in 2022 European tourism because of this release of pent-up demand following the pandemic lockdowns of 2020, 2021. So that's resulting in stellar growth rates in terms of tourism arrivals in 2022, with high double-digit growth rates in many places, especially in Greece, where the numbers are really impressive, and whose tourism sector has managed to manage the crisis and its aftermath really well. There's a much bigger question about what happens in 2023, a lot of uncertainty, I think, about what will be the demand for tourism services next year. And I think that depends on, how bad the hit will be to household finances and household consumption, how things are looking by next spring for the coming winter, what kind of winter we have, because one of the main impacts of this war has been to create uncertainty, a great deal of uncertainty, and consumer confidence has taken a massive hit, actually, on the kind of same scale as the pandemic. So even if it's not showing through in the numbers, it's showing through in terms of consumer confidence. And the final thing is what happens in China as well, which I mentioned earlier. So we don't expect much easing of the zero COVID policies. It will be a gradual process through next year. So that maybe by the second half, things are starting to look a bit better. But China is being really cautious about lifting inbound travel restrictions. So that's a big disincentive to travel, even if things ease up next year, because there's all the requirements of hotel quarantine, PCR tests, and everything else that goes alongside that. So maybe it's going to get to 2024 before we see a resumption of inflows of Chinese tourists and other Asia tourists. I think just there's a lot of uncertainty, but there are upside risks as well. So I wouldn't want it to be all doom and gloom. Things actually might ease up faster in China. Maybe our assumptions about this energy and growth crunch will prove to be too pessimistic. Things that demand for tourism services might actually keep up some momentum next year. But I think we need to think about, what potentially, a kind of worst case scenario and adapt accordingly. Now, I haven't got time to go through these slides, but there's a few slides here about sustainable tourism. I'll probably maybe just go to the final one. So this is the first one. This is just looking at the places that are really going to be affected by climate change. The next one is about the impact on the aviation industry of sustainability targets. And the final one is about risks and opportunities for the industry. There's a lot, everybody's talking about sustainability, sustainable growth, sustainable finance, sustainable tourism, and it's in danger of losing its meaning. But in a nutshell, I guess what we're talking about is trying to prevent overcrowding in popular destinations, reduce the negative impacts of tourism on the environment, and go for a different sort of tourism, increase knowledge of countries' history and culture, and so on. And in terms of solutions, I'm sure you've all been talking about that at this event. You know, it's about promoting neglected locations, neglected islands. It's about extending the season, promoting tourism in the off-season, and you know, in a crisis situation, trying to be to adapt to that. So, with the Greek a few weeks ago, or even months ago, the Greek tourism ministry invited people from Northern Europe to come and spend their winter in Greece. And Greece has been for some years trying to extend its season. The winters are quite clement. Other countries, I know, are doing the same thing. So it's about adapting and trying to respond to these challenges and promoting different types of tourism. But you're the experts about all that, so I'm not going to say any more. And I'm going to finish because I know you're pressed for time, and that's it from me. I'm happy to take questions. I doubt we've got time now, but I'll be outside and happy to talk to any of you about any issues that have been raised. Thank you very much.